I was 5 years old when my mom was sucked into the TV. Experts claimed it was because a hunk of space junk had hit the broadcasting tower, while the raging conspiracy theorists insisted the end of the world was upon us. At exactly 8:29 p.m., halfway through the broadcast of 90,210, 50% of my town, including my parents, ceased to exist. I have a vague memory of sitting cross-legged in front of the TV eating cheese puffs. I wasn't allowed to watch cartoons. They were bad for my brain, according to my parents. So, I was frowning at a child-friendly sitcom with too much laughter. Dad was away for work. He promised he was bringing me a souvenir. Mom was looking for her jacket, already late for work, and my sitter was arriving soon. I remember her last words were sweet and melodic. "Sweetie, do you know where Mommy's jacket is?" She was shoving cushions out of the way, but my eyes were glued to the strange blurry line that had appeared on the TV screen. The woman on the television didn't seem to notice. She was still making the audience laugh, but the line was getting bigger, spider webbing down her face, a gnawing tendril creeping across the screen. Not a lot of things scared me as a kid, except shadows inside a dark room and Santa Claus. But there was something about the blurry blue line, almost a sizzling electric light cutting the smiling woman's face in two, which sent me shuffling back, cheese puff paste squirming its way back up my throat. I told her there was something on the TV, and she ignored me, running around like a frenzied butterfly, searching for her jacket. I never saw her death. If I did, I would never be able to stop seeing it. It happened in the corner of my eye, a squirming blue tendril creeping out of the television. The thing reminded me of a snake, the way it moved, erratically, as if searching for something itself. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Mom never screamed or cried, or even made a noise. She was just gone. In one single electrical surge, with the lights blinking out and the TV emitting a sharp galvanic light directly in my face, my mother was reduced to nothing. I sat there for a long time frowning at the intense blue screen, until familiar arms wrapped around me. They were warm, and I allowed myself to melt into them. "It's okay, Mari," my aunt whispered into my hair. She held me for a long time, her tears wetting my shoulder, before telling me to cover my eyes and count to 10. I still didn't know how, so I counted like the big blue dinosaur did in my favorite TV show, before Mom stopped letting me watch it. Bigsby didn't speak English, so he spoke in his own language instead, teaching me how to say numbers. So, I covered my eyes and could sense my aunt slowly making her way toward the TV. I peeked through my fingers, glimpsing her horrified face bathed in mesmerizing blue. In her trembling hands was my father's favorite hammer. "Schwamp," I whispered. 1. "Della." 2. The sudden loud crash made me jump, but I continued, squeezing my eyes shut. Another bang, and I held my breath. I could hear her sobbing, the thwack of the hammer slamming into the screen over and over again. Barlong. 3. I didn't even get to 5 when the sound of buzzing stopped, my aunt grasping hold of my hand and pulling me out of the house. When I twisted around for another peek, the TV screen was splintered into tiny pieces, a multitude of colors glaring back at me. Aunt May told me it wasn't just my mom. It was Mr. Peterson who owned the diner, and our neighbors who gave me cookies. It was my kindergarten teacher and the woman in the library who read books to me. Everyone was gone. She told me Dad wasn't coming home either. I didn't know what was going on from such a young age, though I could join the dots. It was a ghost town when I walked hand in hand with my aunt to my mother's memorial service. Held in the center of town, my kindergarten classmates stood, some with parents and some without. All of them had their heads bowed. Rosie McClure was holding a bouquet of pretty roses. I liked her hair. It was all curled and pretty, like a princess. Rosie's dress reminded me of Tiana from The Princess and the Frog. I tried smiling at her, but Rosie avoided my eyes, swiping at her eyes. Every so often, she turned to who I presumed was her family, tugging his sleeve. "When is Mommy coming?" she mumbled. I didn't see her mom anywhere. I waited for her. Mrs. McClure never missed out on the public events. She was always there, handing out candy and cookies to all of Rosie's friends. Bellamy Croft was the only one who didn't have his head bowed in prayer. He refused to wear smart clothes, giggling and making stupid noises throughout the ceremony, occasionally remarking, "This is burring," before his big brother and father dragged him away, hissing, "How can you be so disrespectful?" Bellamy didn't seem the least bit fazed, treating it like a game. After the memorial, I didn't go back to our house, the life I knew, which was my bright blue bedroom and the stars stuck on the ceiling. With Mom gone, my aunt took me in quickly, and there was one rule in her bigger, twistier house with too many doors and hallways to explore. No watching TV under any circumstances. I could have limited time on her phone, and sometimes I could go on her laptop, but that was it. I didn't understand why she was suddenly so obsessed with keeping me from watching TV. Aunt May was worse than my mother. This time, however, I wasn't even allowed to watch the child-friendly sitcoms. When I figured out how to work the flat screen in my new room, sitting on my bed and struggling with the remote, Aunt May swooped in like a wind chill, snatching the remote straight out of my hands and then pulling the TV from the wall. It wasn't just at home. In kindergarten, we were taught not to go near TV screens because a scary signal had the potential to hurt us. The kids whose parents were gone didn't question her. I could see it in their eyes that something had happened to them. Rosie McClure didn't speak to anyone, sitting cross-legged on her own, rocking back and forth. She kept saying her mommy wasn't gone, and everyone was stupid for saying her mommy wasn't coming back. I remember Rosie lifted her head, her eyes hollowed out, lips trembling. Now that her mother was gone, she had stopped wearing pretty dresses. Rosie's hair was a tangled mess hanging in her eyes, her clothes, baggy jeans and long shirts that hung off of her, stained and creased. Her white socks were now brown. I overheard Aunt May muttering to another mom that Rosie's adoptive mother was failing as a parent. I didn't understand what that meant until I started seeing lice crawling in Rosie's hair. My aunt's words became evident when she started saying bad words and acting erratically. It started with sudden violent outbursts, attacking other classmates, and disrupting class. "Fuck you," Rosie squeaked out one day, startling the TA trying to calm her down. Every day was Rosie Day, apparently. If the universe wasn't revolving around her, the girl lost it. She lost her patience when the teaching assistant was helping another kid draw. Rosie ripped the drawing from the kid's hand and demanded that the TA help her make a picture for her mother. When the woman paled and calmly explained her mother was not coming back, Rosie started screaming, "My mommy is coming back. She's not gone, she's not gone." Rosie threw the hardback book she had been holding directly in the woman's face. There was a lot of blood and screaming, but the girl stayed stubbornly still, folding her arms. Ignoring the teachers trying to discipline her, Rosie stuck out her tongue. Her gaze didn't even find the TA, whose nose was broken, who was kneeling on the floor, pressing bloodied tissue paper to her face. There was blood all over the carpet, and my classmate was completely unfazed. Instead, Rosie laughed, pointing to the TV screen on the wall, the one which hadn't been turned on since the incident. "My mom is famous." I couldn't help myself, speaking to her amidst the chaos. "Your mommy is on TV?" She nodded with a grin. "Yep." Rosie's eyes twinkled with delight, and that made me excited. "And so is yours." Something warm ignited in my belly, a sudden rush of hope. Hope that Mom would come home after all, and Dad's trip was just long. But why would Aunt May lie? She said lies were bad, so it didn't make sense that she would lie. Still though, I wanted to believe my classmate. I wasn't allowed to watch TV, so I wouldn't know. I was suddenly overcome with relief and happiness twisting my gut. Was my mommy really famous? Is that where she went the day Aunt May broke our TV? Before I could speak, Rosie met my gaze, like she knew exactly what I was going to say. "And your daddy," she said. "Your mommy and daddy are famous, just like mine." The girl pointed to Alice Jarrett, and then Oliver Stevens, the two of them backing away from her. "Yours too. They're all there." She was prodding at the TV, smiling widely. "If you just turn it on, you'll see." "Okay, sweetie, that's enough." Mrs. Leela, our new kindergarten teacher, spoke sternly, her voice shaking. I noticed she kept shooting frenzied looks at the TV screen and thought back to that electrical blue light I saw the day Mom disappeared. Mrs. Leela was just like my aunt and everyone else in town. Mr. Carlisle, who had taken ownership of the diner, had every screen removed. Even the movie theater was closed. My teacher, just like every other surviving adult, was terrified of televisions. I watched Mrs. Leela calmly scoop Rosie into her arms, nestling her face into the girl's wrangled ponytail. I thought she was crying, but Bellamy, sitting next to me, scoffed, calling them crocodile tears. I shoved him, and he shoved me back, 10 times harder. "I think you need quiet time." Mrs. Leela hummed, "Come on, Rosie." Rosie was escorted out of the classroom, and we were reminded to not watch TV, to not even touch the screen. Except I had just been told my mother was still alive and famous on television. It was impossible not to risk it, even with my aunt's strict orders. So, I waited until she was in bed, forcing myself to stay awake. There was a TV inside the lounge. I caught my aunt staring at the black screen, or sometimes even switching it on, her ghostly pale face illuminated in flickering blue. She would sit there for hours, silently watching galvanic blue, her eyes unblinking, lips slightly parted. I always wondered what she was watching, so I decided to see for myself. My aunt's house was scary in the dark. Aunt May's door was shut, so I stood on my tiptoes to switch the lights on. I slid out of my room, creeping down the long, winding hallway leading to the staircase. I remember the walls feeling alive, tiny eyes burning into the back of my head. When I reached the top of the staircase, I held my breath and ran as fast as I could before I could turn around, peering into oblivion closing in. Luckily, the lounge lights were still on. I dropped to my knees in front of the TV. Aunt May made sure to hide the remote, but there was a special secret button on the back. Hesitantly, I tapped it, and to my surprise, the screen flooded with familiar light. I sat, entranced by flickering blue, before the screen bled into a television show. I recognized it. It was the cooking show my dad watched after work. The host, a pretty blonde woman, smiled at the camera. I recognized her from the library. She was making chicken pot pie. I smiled back like she could see me, lifting my hand in a wave. "Okay, folks." Her eyes were glued to the screen. "Let's make the pastry." I made myself comfortable, sitting on a sofa cushion. "Okay, folks." The presenter trilled once again, shooting the camera that same wide, toothy grin. She wasn't moving, I noticed, stuck to the same spot. Her hands were in the exact same position, fingers wrapped around the wooden spoon. There was no pastry. Instead, the mixing bowl was full of something else, the rim stained, revealing red. The screen seemed to twitch, and so did the presenter. I couldn't stop myself, shuffling forwards and pressing my face against the screen. The feeling of pins and needles hit me, spreading across my cheeks and forehead, a warm, fuzzy sensation. I couldn't tear my gaze from the bowl. The sound of the audience was different. They weren't clapping like normal. Instead, a droning noise sparked from the speakers. I jumped back. Strawberry jam, I thought. She was making strawberry pie. It had to be, but I wasn't sure strawberry pies had eyes in them. Coming closer to the screen, I could see them, fleshy chunks, writhing eyes that still moved. Her smile widened, until I could see something pulling at the edges of her grinning mouth. Again, the screen flashed. The fleshy red thing in the bowl was gone. "Let's make the pastry." The presenter's facial expression froze, and I remember wanting to turn it off, covering my eyes. The way she just stopped mixing, coming to an eerie standstill, shriveled up my gut. Peeking through my hands over my eyes, the screen flashed. Her mouth formed an O, like she was screaming, before more colors bled into the woman's face, reverting her back to a smile. I don't think I'll ever forget the way she moved, erratically, like on puppet strings. Then I saw her hands. I saw the scratch marks, the claw marks on her wrists, the sharp lines of red painting her. I saw it. Before the slither of electric blue corrected her face, I saw her screech. I saw her claw at the hair. "I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't do this." I couldn't read them, but I was sure the subtitles followed her lips easily, before changing to, "Now, folks, let's make the pastry." The camera moved away from the presenter, and my eyes followed it feverishly. I saw Rosie's mom first. She was in the front row, mouth split into a wide smile, just like the presenter. Mrs. McClure was clapping wildly, almost falling off her seat, like she was watching a really good movie. Then I saw her. Mom. I don't think my mind fully registered her face. I only saw what I knew, what I remember, instead of the cruel reality. She really was famous. Her head was bent at an unnatural angle and her eyes were too wide. But it was my mother. In the back row, my mom sat with the rest of the missing townspeople, clapping like everyone else. I prodded the screen, as if I could get her attention. Mom kept staring forwards, unblinking. I was so fixated on seeing her again, I barely noticed her head wasn't screwed on properly. Mom reminded me of one of my dolls. When she turned around, however, her eyes falling out of their sockets, the right side of her face collapsing, melting into the screen. I couldn't move. Mom was famous. But what had the TV done to her? I couldn't breathe. I was still watching my mom's jaw snapping open and shut like a toy, her raucous laughter screeching from the speakers, when Aunt May's hands covered my eyes. I barely noticed her, not even when she turned off the TV and pulled me into a hug, squeezing me tight. At first, I still couldn't move. The world felt wrong around me, too closed in, like it was going to crash into me. I could still see Mom in the backs of my eyes. She was still laughing, still clapping, her mouth growing wider and wider and wider until it was falling apart, her whole face crumpling, bleeding into dancing static colors. Mom. I managed to heave out a sob, my body trembling. That, Aunt May spoke through her teeth, her voice splintering. That is not your mother, Mari. She held me at arm's length, her thumb swiping tears from my eyes. Her expression was fierce. Do you understand me? I didn't move, didn't speak, before she switched the TV back on. This time, Aunt May used the remote, switching to a Christmas movie. There was a snowy street that looked exactly like our town, and a couple walking hand in hand. I didn't recognize the woman in the Santa hat, but the man holding her hand was my father. Just like the cooking show, the two of them only went several steps before reverting back to where they started, in the exact same position. Dad looked happy. His smile for the stranger was different than the one he had for Mom. I didn't like the music in the background suggesting my dad was in love. Do you think we're going to have the best Christmas ever, Chrissy? His voice was the same, prickling from the speakers. Well, if we're spending Christmas at my mom's house, Al. I like your mom, Dad argued. She makes great cookies. The woman nodded, laughing. But the closer I looked, every time the screen flickered and the scene reset, there were fresh claw marks on my dad's face and footprints in the snow, like they had been running or trying to run. Aunt May turned off the TV when my dad's mouth seemed to falter, his wide smile stretching into a screen. Dad looked directly at the camera. His mouth was still wide open, eyes wide and terrified, when the TV went black. I'll never get that image out of my head. And that is not your father. Aunt May turned me away from the TV, pulling me from Dad's shadow. I swore I could still see him printed on the black screen. Her hands came down on my shoulders. Mari, there was an incident several months ago, she whispered. Your mommy and daddy are not coming back. And what is on there? She gestured to the screen, is a cruel, painful trick that will not let them rest. When I didn't respond, my gaze stuck to the screen. Aunt May shook me. Tell me you won't touch a TV screen again, she whispered. Promise me, Mari. I promised her. Even on my birthdays when the temptation started to eat me up inside, I stopped myself peeking at Mom and Dad. It's not like there was anything left of them. When I was old enough, Aunt May calmly explained that the two of them were officially dead, their bodies being used as puppets. That talk unnerved me enough to throw out the ancient TV I had shoved under my bed for emergencies. The emergency being, secretly telling my parents the milestones I was going through growing up. But I didn't want to talk to empty shells. Mom was being used as a prop in the audience, and Dad's remnants showed up in the never-ending showing of Hallmark movies. The town banned TVs as a whole, eventually, and we all moved on. I stopped writing letters to Mom because it hurt, and found comfort in drawing. We didn't move on just like that. It took time, years flying by, for me to come to the realization that I was never seeing my parents again. It was a sobering, and yet kind of relieving feeling, like a weight being lifted off my chest. I started middle school, attending the town memorial every year that remembered the dead. I won't say we were happy. Rosie McClure grew into a sociopath because of her upbringing and failed parenting. Aunt May started drinking, only when she knew I was out for the night. When I was in, I poured the bottles down the sink. Still though, as a town, we found a weird sort of peace. We couldn't fully move on, but we could lay down the foundations. That was until a year later when it came back, this time in the form of a deadly virus. It started in the children of the disappeared. I was 13 years old when Alice Jarrett complained of a headache in class. She was sitting behind me, and in usual Alice fashion, she was being dramatic, groaning onto the grains of her desk. We all ignored her, because Alice Jarrett was known as the girl who cried wolf, or more suitably, the girl who cried sickness. I was scribbling on my notebook, zoning in and out of the teacher's droning explanation of fractions. Alice had already announced she didn't feel well, and the teacher just nodded with a strained smile and told her to hold it out until class was over. With any other student, it was an automatic trip to the nurse's office. With Alice, it was rolled eyes and an exaggerated sigh. Without TV, my classmates and I had been brought up on YouTube. Aunt May didn't know I was watching Adventure Time on her iPad, but I was sure she wouldn't mind. After all, it wasn't technically TV. I was shading in my badly drawn Finn the Human, who looked more like a noodle man, when Alice Jarrett let out a shriek behind me. What's happening? Her cry sent a shiver ripping its way down my spine. I actually turned around because, for once, Alice was actually crying. Initially, I thought the girl's pin had leaked all over her desk, pooling black soaking her books. But then my gaze was finding Alice Jarrett, who had jumped to her feet, her hands covering her face. I thought she was going to barf, but she was trying to hide it, whatever was dripping from her chin. It wasn't blood. It wasn't even red. Instead, it was like ink, tinging her tears. Pins and needles, I thought dizzily. It looked exactly what pins and needles felt like, buzzing static seeping from every orifice, her mouth, ears, and nose. Alice opened her mouth to ask what was happening, but whatever was pouring from her was also eating away at her flesh, starving static burrowing into her eyes and gnawing at her mouth. When Alice dropped to her knees, our class were told to get back. The oozing black substance was already on the floor, spreading like it had a mind of its own. I watched, paralyzed, as Alice was eaten out of existence, consumed by pins and needles that writhed across her flesh. It didn't stop until she was gone, until every part of her was gone. All that was left of her was Alice's bright yellow backpack. That same day, I stay at home with a gnawing feeling in my gut, watching our mayor address the town with a strained smile. I kept checking my face in the mirror. I became obsessive, checking and rechecking to see if I was bleeding pins and needles. Offering condolences to Alice's family, the mayor reassured us that it was an isolated incident. He ignored questions about the barrier of galvanic blue that had appeared overnight, splitting the town in half. This thing was opaque and impenetrable, a giant wall of buzzing static. The mayor told us not to panic and that he had everything under control. By the end of the week, 2 kids in my class were dead, succumbing to the exact same headache, static seeping from their nose. The outbreak soon had a name. TX flu, 90,210 syndrome, named after the TV show that was broadcasted during the so-called anomaly. The mayor announced 2 symptoms to look out for: a sudden headache that will not go away, bleeding from the nose that cannot be explained. The infected weren't random. Rosie McClure dropped dead right in front of me on the school grounds. Rosie was known for being a bully and had been screaming at Callan Holland to show her his nose. Apparently, he had a nosebleed. Ironically, that was when she swiped at the own nose, and sure enough, her sleeve was stained black. I think this thing was already learning as it infected more kids. She was dead before the static started eating her. We were all thinking it, but it wasn't confirmed until the mayor addressed us one evening, after confirming the death toll had reached 300. Adults and children, mainly children, with parents and loved ones who were taken by the anomaly, were the majority infected. This thing wasn't contagious to anyone but the children of the disappeared, which meant I was a ticking time bomb. The first time I became terrified of my own reflection. I stopped looking in mirrors, and the slightest pain in my head made me spiral. There was no cure, nothing to soften the blow, not even an answer. Officially, it was TX flu. Not even the CDC were touching it. In my aunt's words, they were going to cover it up from the rest of the world. So, the real world have no idea about a flesh-eating virus lurking in their TVs. I didn't blame them. I was starting to feel like the background character in a disaster movie. You know, the random, no-name middle schooler who succumbed to the virus off-screen, while the teenage heroes continued their quest to save the world. I spent the next few years forcing myself to live normally, even when normal had crashed and burned. I kept expecting to catch TX flu, but I was lucky not to. School wasn't really school anymore, after a group of kids in town dead. It was called Learning Time and was a mandatory 2-hour class that educated us on the basics if we happened to survive. The mayor announced we were in quarantine until further notice. For years later, and it was still until further notice. There were a bunch of kids in my class. 5 of them were considered non-infected, their parents still intact, while I was the ticking time bomb they were expecting to pop. One day, just like my parents. Led by Bellamy Croft, known for despising infected kids, these guys loved getting under my skin. Unlike me, they did watch TV, They thought they were invincible by not having a parent that had been eaten by the static. So they regularly watched my dad and mom. For them, it was a fucking joke. Maybe that's why I punched Bellamy in the nose, landing the two of us in detention. So he followed me home, determined to level the playing field. Aunt May was very strict with her curfew, and I was well aware it was past 5. The sky was already pitch black, a wind chill blowing my hair back. I didn't mean to follow them. Bellamy took my backpack and ran into the woods. I had no choice. I had definitely underestimated how low Bellamy could go. When I tried to grab for my pack, he twisted around and flung it straight through the wall of galvanic blue. We're not allowed near the barrier. It's cordoned off with yellow tape, but I had found myself jumping over the do not cross signs, lunging for the boy dangling my backpack over my head. Go on. His southern accent made me cringe. The kid was all muscle, wild brown eyes, and a feral grin. Ever since his father had left town when he was 13, Bellamy Croft had gone completely off the rails, blaming everyone but himself for his dad leaving. Ever since he was a kid, he had found something amusing about my parents being stolen away. To him, they were cartoon characters, puppets on strings. He cocked his head to the side. Fetch. Emma, his girlfriend, burst out laughing. Belle, that's like, so cruel. Her eyes glinted with that exact same sparkle of madness. They were made for each other. Truly. Soapy took a step toward me, his smile widening. Fucking bitch deserves it, his expression twisted, lips curling in disgust. Bellamy nodded to the barrier. It should have taken you with them, he spat. Family reunion, right? Normally, I didn't react. But there was something about the way he said them through gritted teeth that boiled my blood. Then pushed me through. The words were slipping from my lips before I could stop them. It's not like I hadn't considered stepping through the barrier and maybe finding my parents again. Sometimes I swore they were calling to me through the barrier. Their voices were almost a lullaby, a melody taunting me to join them. But the idea of willingly giving myself to the static made my stomach turn. Bellamy lifted a brow in surprise, before his eyes widened, lips twisting. Duck. His cry didn't make sense until Emma was dragging me to the ground, flattening the three of us into the dirt. Emma had her hand over my mouth, and I struggled to pull it away, trying to scream, when a sharp cry pierced the night, and I swore Bellamy whimpered, his own hand covering his mouth. Please. I didn't do anything, I swear. The voice was a man. When I arched my neck, looking closer, I glimpsed an oldish guy on his knees in front of the barrier. Behind him were 2 local soldiers pointing their guns at the back of his head. Walk, one of them grunted, protruding the weapon into his skull. But I can't just. The gunshot sent me into the dirt, slamming my hand over my mouth. The boy hit the ground, and we watched, horrified, as the soldier scooped the man into his arms and flung him through the barrier. I had never seen a human go through it. Just like with Alice Jarrett, the static took its time, eating the manhole. Bellamy and Emma shoved me down when I tried to risk a peek, because we were far too loud. The crunch of the bee branches under our feet, and Bellamy stumbling over a rock. We managed maybe 3 steps before the boy flattened us into the ground once more. I pressed my face into the dirt and counted my breaths, squeezing onto the others like their trembling hands were my anchors. What are you doing here? The voice came from above us. When I lifted my head, the shadow of the soldier loomed. He paused for a moment, drinking each of us in. I've got 3 brats hanging around near the anomaly, he murmured into his talkie. How do I proceed? The crackle of the talkie feedback felt like nails on a chalkboard. Next to me, Bellamy was sniffling. Was he crying? Emma had lifted her head, but the boy was still trying to hide himself in the soil. What is their condition? A female voice hissed through the talkie. The soldier sighed. I could barely see an identity on him. Clean, he said. They're all clean. No visual signs of TX. Give them a warning. The voice came through the talkie in a sigh. Take them home. The soldier hesitated. He cleared his throat. Mayim, they witnessed a feed. A pause, and I thought I was going to throw up. Emma caught my eye, her lips twisted. Feed? She mouthed. Ashton, I am fairly certain you know what the protocol is, the voice groaned. All witnesses get a blank, she hesitated. That includes brats. Give them strawberry. It's the best tasting one. Yes, Mayim. The soldier clicked off the talkie. His gaze flicked to Bellamy still sobbing into the ground. He sighed, pocketing his gun. Relax, I'm not going to kill you. You can get up, kid. Bellamy didn't move. I figured it was time to speak up, since Emma conveniently forgot how to speak English. "He's not going to kill us," I repeated, resisting rolling my eyes. I shoved him with my foot, and he still didn't move. The soldier pulled out his gun, slowly. "Kid, lift your head for me. Right now." "I don't want to." Bellamy's whisper surprised me. The boy was trembling, curled into himself. "Lift your head." The soldier's voice turned flat and emotionless. "If you refuse, I will have no choice but to." The soldier's voice choked into a yell when Bellamy slowly looked up, immediately raising his arms in surrender. Emma screamed, shuffling back on her hands and knees. I could see the slither of blackened, mutated static-like slime pooling from his nostril. "I'm not sick," he sobbed, through a mouthful of pins and needles dripping down his chin. I could see half of his hair was already gone, a fleshy chunk of his ear left. Bellamy's eyes were still alive, still intact. But already I could see the swarm beginning its feast across his face. "Fuck," he whispered, his words tangling when half of his lips were stripped away. His arms dropped to his side, like the boy's body was dying, and yet the static wanted to puppeteer, using his flesh and bones as personal doll. Bellamy's mouth opened, his jaw loose just like my mom. His eyes were no longer his blurry balls of flickering static. This time it was different. With Bellamy, it wasn't like he was being eaten. It was like he was being rewritten. The soldier's next words sent my heart into my throat. "All three of you, stand up." I didn't move until he was pointing his gun at us, finger on the trigger. I said, "Get up." I jumped to my feet, pulling Emma with me. "Walk," he shot Bellamy, but the bullets just bounced off of him. "I'm not." Bellamy's voice was a cruel imitation, slurring into tongues. "I'm not sick. I swear." He held up the remnants of his hands. "See? Clear." I said, "Walk." The man yelled. "Any contact with that thing means you're already infected. If he's a goner, you are too." He nodded at Bellamy, or what was left of my classmate. "It's the best thing to do, and I'm sorry. I really am." Shaking, the man protruded the gun into my classmate's head. "Now walk fucking do it, kid. I don't want to shoot you." The boy did, stumbling directly into the barrier. Emma followed, her body melting right in front of me, her scream glitching in and out of reality. I didn't get a chance to speak, to beg for mercy. The smooth edge of the soldier's magnum brushed the back of my neck. I was told to take another step, and another. The closer I got to the anomaly, I could feel it, sense it bleeding into me. Pins and needles, static chewing through my flesh. One more step, and my nose was bleeding, drops of ink staining my hands. I started to back away, my mouth opening in a plea. Before I knew what was happening, I was being violently shoved forwards. Impact was like hitting shattering glass that came alive, feasting on my flesh and ripping me apart. Through the slowly collapsing pinprick swallowing my vision, I saw a multitude of TV shows collapsing into static red and blue, my body shaped and molded and purged to fit each one. I'm not sure how to explain only living, existing as scattered consciousness, my physical body gone. I was half aware of hands, human hands grasping onto me. I slept for a while, but my dreams were one single voice. "Entertain me, pretty doll." I awoke sitting on a patchy couch. My arms were too long, my body contorted into a giant, bulging thing that I could barely move. Looking down at my hands, they were huge, weighing me down. I had bright pink skin and orange polka dots. I recognized the colorful backdrop around me, cartoonish furniture, walls that collapsed into liminal spaces that went on forever, custard dripping from the ceiling. It was the kids' show I grew up with, Bigsby's Little World. The door flew open, and what was left of Bellamy Croft stumbled through, bulbous eyes and a giggling mouth. The boy's physical body was gone, only his eyes were left, lodged into the front of his head. His tiny legs skittered on the floor like bugs. "Okay, kids," Bellamy bellowed, through lips curled into a silent scream. Help me, I could see the words shaping on his huge mouth, but all that came out was schwabeldong. Half of Emma's head was sticking out of his skull, her blinking eyes begging me to kill her. "Entertain me." The voice was back inside my head. It sounded like a little girl, a screech rattling my skull. It hit me. My parents weren't dead, were the kids who fell victim to TX flu. They were here, inside the static. As if obeying, Bellamy's mouth opened impossibly wide, his eyes screaming at me to run. "Run? Where?" "It's Ty Thiatin to play." "Sorry, that's all can write for now." Coming out of the wave fucked up my physical body, so typing is hard. I've been stewing inside a facility with the majority of us for a while, and I just got internet. It feels good to talk about it.